Good morning. Thank you very much to the organizers for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here and looking forward to interesting discussion in our panel. What I will talk about in the next 10 to 15 minutes is the long-term prospects on electricity, and I would like to address basically three topics or questions. First, the relevance of the electricity globally and in the different regions. Second, the challenges the utilities industry is facing with all the disruption and all the developments we already discussed or can all of us observe in the industry. And what are the business opportunities which I see with these changes in the industry. Maybe first to give some overview, and most of them is known to you, of course. We will see a further demand growth in electricity demand globally, but also in the larger regions. We have in some regions, like in the European Union and also in the USA, we see already a clear decoupling in the last years between GDP growth and electricity demand, and we see that in other regions like growing economies like India or also China, we see a clear correlation between the GDP growth and growth of electricity demand. And what we also see is that, and this is what we already heard in the morning, that renewables will increase or have been increasing in the last decades or last 15 years, but still fossil energy is very dominant in our generation mix today. Of course, it's important for the whole discussion, the CO2 intensity of power generation. Today, we have about 43% of the CO2 emissions globally coming from power generation. So it's this part or power generation is very important for the global development of CO2 emission. And in the last 15 or 13 years, we have been observing already globally a decreasing of the intensity of the CO2 intensity of power generation, but in some of the regions also an increase, like in India. Very significant improvement on the CO2 intensity in power generation we can observe in the European Union, basically due to the growth of renewables. Just an example, in India, the CO2 emissions are growing in India like in other growing economies. And also in India, it's very much depending on the power generation and on the coal-fired power generation, the development of the CO2 emissions. What is the outlook? And the outlook is based on the International Energy Agency, on the scenarios and on the new policy scenario, and what we see globally, that we will see an increase and further increase of the electricity demand, not so much growing than in the past, but still growing. And we see that the renewables are growing very fast. I would call this as business as usual scenario. I would expect a higher increase of renewables in the next decades if we see disruptive developments like what we already discussed today in storage. If we see a disruptive development in storage, it could be even higher, the share of renewables in the next decades. And what we also see that still on a global level, the fossil energy or the fossil fuel is very much important, or very important for power generation also in the future, despite the fact that renewables is growing very, very fast. The same is true for India. In India, we see an even higher increase of demand, like in other regions, China and others. growing economies will have a higher growth of electricity demand, and we see in such countries like India still an even higher dependency still on fossil fuel in power generation. In the European Union and in the US, we don't see the growth of electricity demand like on a global base or like in growing economies. It's not so fast growing, but also here it's depending a bit. This is a business as usual scenario, but if you imagine that there are some disruptive developments in technology like e-vehicles, storage and so on, it could also increase, the increase of demand could be higher in the next decades, depending on the technologies. The CO2 emission intensity in the sector will decrease on a global scale by about 30 to 35%. In India, about 30%. In the European Union, based on the very ambitious plans, will be reduced by nearly 60%. US, nearly 40%. And this is important for the whole CO2 emission situation globally, as this is the most important single lever on CO2 emissions, the power generation. Also important is the question, what is the share in the future of electricity in the whole energy demand? Today it's globally at about 18%, and it will increase in the next years and the next decades to 25% in a business as usual scenario, but could be even much higher based on disruptive developments in the technology, as I already pointed out. It's comparable in other regions like European Union and US. It's a bit higher, and also in other regions like India, the increase will be very significant. The share of electricity in the overall demand will increase significantly. So, what are the challenges for the industry and for the utilities especially, but also for other industries? One of the most important challenge, of course, is the CO2 emission situation. And as you know, COP21, the climate conference in Paris last December, there was a discussion what are the future objectives, and all the countries brought in pledges. What we see is that a business as usual scenario would lead to a further increase of CO2 emissions until 2050. But if we would, or if we want to meet the goals and the targets, especially the 2-degree target until the end of the century, then we need a reduction of CO2 emissions, a significant reduction. So this is still a challenge, because the business as usual scenarios will not lead to meet the targets which were defined in Paris. Just as one example, India, I will not go into much detail here. All the countries, or more than 190 countries, brought in pledges in Paris, what they want to do and what they want to achieve in the next years and decades. These are pledges, not legally binding commitments. So there is some comments that this is not enough, and also in terms of the volume, it's not enough, because this will not lead to the 2-degree Celsius target. So it has to be done more, but I think it's a good start. And this is, of course, will be a major driver for the electricity industry and the utilities in the next decades. The other major challenge, and this was already mentioned, and the numbers should be the same as already mentioned before in the keynote speech, we will see, or we will need tremendous investments into the sector, and to attract capital from investors into this sector, we need, this is my belief, we need a market-oriented environment, a stable environment that companies, that investors invest in this sector, because it's not possible that all these investments are made by governments, by states. This will not work. We need an attractive environment in the industry to attract investments, and we need companies which invest into innovations and technology development, and this is very important for the further development of the sector. What are the business opportunities, not only for the utilities but also for others who are in the supplier market or in startups or digital environment? What are the business opportunities? And I see basically 3 drivers for the opportunities in the sector. First, what I mentioned already is the climate change and the policy based on this climate change globally. So we will see in the next decades a framework, an environment, a political environment which makes CO2 emissions more expensive and makes new technologies more attractive. This will lead to big opportunities, but also, of course, for big risks and high risks for utilities, which will not change fast enough. A second opportunity, of course, also mentioned already today, the new technologies itself, the renewables, but not only renewables, but also storage and other technologies like energy efficiency is also very important. And I think that it's important to use the new opportunities we get with the digitalization, and this will help to transform the energy systems, which is very important, because we already heard today that it's not only to invest in renewables, it's also to integrate them into the system and to balance the system. This is very important. So we need technologies also for the integration of the renewables into the system, and we will see high investments and high increase of renewables, especially in China or India, according to the plans. And what is also an opportunity for utilities, but also for others, is that we will still see a further growth of demand. I think this is not a bad development, because this means that the overall energy efficiency will increase, and we need electricity to reduce the overall energy demand globally. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dr. Florian.